news conference going on in Berlin, and it's starting just now.
The events are still work in progress. The German authorities are in close contact with the Italian colleagues. I ask you for patience. I would like to add and say that I can say something from the part of the Federal Interior Ministry. We do not have a firm confirmation from the Italian authorities which was sent to us, but the Italian colleagues from the criminal office there, they have confirmed that the person who we believe is the very strong suspect to have committed the attack in Berlin is actually the person who was shot in Milan. This is, of course, not yet confirmed, officially confirmed. I would like to ask you for your patience, just like my colleague, Mrs. Demmer, but the indications would be pointing towards the person being the attacker. If the events are confirmed, then, of course, the Interior Ministry will be relieved because the person will no longer pose a public threat. We are very grateful to the Italian authorities to the very close and confidential flow of information in the course of this morning, not just as regards the events that my colleague has just been pointing out, but also our colleagues in the General Consulate in Milan. They were informed very early and very confidentially as to the events of this morning. There were direct contacts with the Consul General and also the police president, and we are very grateful to the Italian authorities. Mrs. Gladbeck, please. Do you have any information as to how the suspect was able to arrive in Milan? Are you thinking of perhaps establishing a closer-knit control at border points? As to the security measures, in particular after the attack in Berlin, as to which security measures were taken, obviously for operative reasons I cannot give you any details on that because the investigation would be under threat if I were to elucidate on that. I ask you for your understanding. Well, obviously, I can tell you that we are doing more security checks at border points. As to the travel itinerary of the person, I would also like to ask you for your understanding. Obviously, that is also a matter of investigation undertaken by the Federal Prosecutor's Office, and that is also not information I can divulge. Which border posts will be controlled more intensely? And which efforts have you taken over the last few days? Well, in general, you can assume that all of the authorities in the federal authorities and also in the regional authorities, all security and safety measures will be investigated. No stone will be turned, will be left unturned. Some security measures will have to be ramped up. That's obvious. Yes, the security measures were generally and generically increased, and I think the Minister has already confirmed that. Mr. Clark, please.
Also dafür gilt das Gleiche wie für die eine Teilfrage.
The same applies here as the same with the question of your colleague. I cannot give you any details on that. I'm sorry. Mr. Decker, please.
Zurück und zu den Ereignissen der letzten Tage und Wochen und Monate. Die Frage, die sich gestern viele gestellt haben, war, wo war die Schwachstelle?
The question that a lot of people ask themselves and the authorities is, where were the weak points? How was it possible that the suspect could remain free despite the number of suspicions, also the suspicion that he might be a terrorist. Do you see any weak points in the course of events and also in the security network? Mr. Decker, again, this is far too early. The investigation is still ongoing. It is obvious that it is standard of political as well as police work, given the terrible attack in Berlin, that afterwards you need to turn each and every stone to see and investigate as to where the security measures can be improved and perfectionized. When the Interior Minister was saying that perhaps there might be legal consequences, but obviously it's far too early, and the dead bodies are still not buried, as far as I know. But that does not necessarily mean to say that there will not be any consequences in generic terms. That will be the result or the consequence of all the investigation and the work is being undertaken in a magnificent and very, very good manner. But of course, we have to ask ourselves, not improve the measures. If you turn back your memory to summer and the events in Munich, in Ansbach, in Reutlingen, in Würzburg, you can remember that over a period of time, the Interior Minister actually approached the media, approached the press, telling about measures that have partially already implemented. So this is not only paying lip service, but these are concrete and practical measures. And of course, we need to be careful and we need to be cautious, but at the same time also speedy in implementing these measures. But that, of course, is dependent on the investigation results. Mrs. Müller, please. Who has been officially informed in Germany from Italy and by Italy? Question number 2. Were you totally surprised that the suspect turned up in Italy, or did you have any prior indication that he might turn up in Italy?
Ja, also vielleicht fange ich mal an, weil es, glaube ich, zwei Teilfragen gibt, die sich...
Perhaps I can take the first part of the question. The information that we have available is that there were German federal criminal police officers based in Italy, and they were informed. And the second question on the surprise element, I can understand why you're interested in that, but in order to give you a sensible answer to this, I would have to have available interim results, but of course the interim results will not go to me, but they will go to my colleagues from the Federal Criminal Office, and I ask you for your understanding. Just like Mr. Platte and Mrs. Demmer, I cannot confirm the death of Mr. Amri. That is the task of the Italian authorities, and indeed that's something that they have or seem to have done already. And the information they need to come from the Italian authorities. As far as I'm concerned, I have to thank the Italian authorities for the very close, very useful and very confidential flow of information, also with the German foreign representations. That's in Rome as well as in Milan. I can also confirm that the federal government is in close contact with the Italian authorities, but we do not as yet have an official confirmation, and the federal prosecutor hasn't confirmed the news either. Are we talking about the same contact officer who's been coordinating and liaising with the Italian authorities? Is it the same contact officer? Yes. In many German foreign representations, also in Rome, we have a contact officer, and these officers are normally officers of the Federal Criminal Office who serve in a foreign representation, a consulate or an embassy, in order to coordinate the liaison, the coordination. When I was talking about our Consulate General in Milan, that this consulate had a contact with the Italian authorities, namely with the incumbent police president of the Milan region. That's something I can confirm. The contact officer, was he sent given the current state of events, or is that a normal standard procedure? Is he always there? I'm not entirely certain as to whether such an officer would be in place and on site all the time, but as regards Italy and Germany, we would have a standing representative, i.e. we would have a police officer, a liaison officer, and also a customs liaison officer, always on site in Italy, so that person or those persons were not especially and particularly delegated to Italy.
Können Sie den Menschen erklären, warum die Duldungsbescheinigung des Täters derartig spät gefunden wurde?
Can you perhaps confirm or tell as to why the certificate of suspended deportation was found so late? Well, the same applies here. It seems that you have information as to when that certificate and those documents were found. I don't have that information, but the same applies here. This is part of an ongoing investigation, an investigation that is not undertaken by the Interior Ministry, but by the Federal Criminal Office and the Prosecution Office.
Wären mindestens 12 Stunden sozusagen nach der Tat entdeckt worden.
It's been reported that the Federal Interior Minister confirmed that the documentation was found 12 hours after the attack. And this seems to contradict certain tweets. The two additional questions that you pose do not really change the outline of what we are talking about here, so I have no further comment to make.
Ohne Zweifel Herrn Amri handelt. Welche Informationen können denn deutsche Behörden an ihre europäischen Kollegen geschickt, die so eine Identifizierung schnell zulassen würden?
Which type of information did the German authorities send to their European counterparts in order to make an identification of the suspect beyond any reasonable doubt? In this concrete case as to how the German authorities were informed, well, I've already talked about that. The other question was as to how the suspect was identified. That, of course, is a question to ask to the Italian authorities, but normally this would happen via fingerprinting that would ascertain a result beyond any reasonable doubt.
Der Fahndungsaufruf, Herr Jordans, ist ja vom GBA rausgegangen. Insofern müssen Sie diese Frage an
the appeal for a manhunt that was sent out by the General Federal Prosecution Office. You have to ask them.
Ja, die Vielleicht fange ich mit dem letzten an.
Perhaps I'll start with your last question. I can confirm, well, I can't confirm this, because details on the personal data pertaining to Mr. Amri, i.e. the suspect and most likely also the offender. All these questions cannot be conclusively clarified at this point in time, so I can't give you any concrete information on the personal details. As to the number of possible threats to public order, we are talking about just under 550 people in Germany, or well over 300 people who might be a public threat in Germany. I don't have the precise figures in front of me, but I'm going to look them up in a moment, and I'm going to tell you also as to how many people of those are already in detention.
Gibt es im Moment eine rechtliche Basis, auf der Herr Amri in Abschiebehaft genommen werden konnte früher und dort gelassen wäre?
Das ist auch bei mir. Also ist auch bei mir eine Zuständigkeit. Abschiebehaft ist sozusagen kein justizieller
Well, that's my responsibility, really. So the detention prior to deportation is a matter of the Federal Interior Ministry. But once again, I ask you for your understanding, because the question really that you ask pertains very much to this particular event here. So the question as to whether the suspect could have been taken into detention, well, that's a question I cannot possibly answer at this point in time without intervening and obstructing the ongoing investigation. Also the question as to what the suspect was alleged to have committed. While I'm talking, I can tell you that the 550 public threats, approximately half of them are in Germany and 80 of them are in detention. Also, we have a circle of more than 330 people who we call relevant people. I'm not going to reiterate that, but those are people where the information is not quite as concrete, but we need to have them on the radar.
Ja, also ich kann Ihnen gerne sozusagen die Vorschrift zur Abschiebehaft vorlesen. Ich weiß jetzt nicht, ob Ihnen
I'm very happy to read out to you the provisions on detention prior to deportation. It needs to, such detention needs to happen on the decision made by a judge, and I'm quoting from the Civil Procedure Code. Of course, the person needs to be qualifying for such a deportation. The deportation needs to happen speedily. The period of leave needs to have expired. The deportee needs to be able to quote an address in the home country where he needs to be repatriated. All of these are alternatives, or there are reasons, or there are reasons where there is a risk that the detainee might be escaping. These are effectively the provisions pertaining to detention prior to deportation. One question pertains to the exchange with the Italian authorities. Were there, prior to the events, any possible indications that Mr. Amri was planning something? It's a question that's already been posed. And the second question relates to what we have heard, namely that Mr. Amri was taken off the radar. The surveillance operation was no longer conducted after September this year. But apparently Mr. Amri was a topic in a meeting held by the Interior Ministry Committee. After all, the question as to why he was a topic is not quite relevant. Once again, I might be boring you. It's effectively a question formulated slightly differently, but this pertains to ongoing investigations, so I cannot give you any details on that. Mr. Hartwig, please.
denkbaren Zeitrahmen nennen, ist denn sichergestellt, dass trotz der Feiertagssituation der Parlamentspause bis Mitte Januar das gegebenenfalls auch tatsächlich zügig dann implementiert werden kann, falls es legislative Maßnahmen sind, falls es exekutive Maßnahmen sind?
Ja, also die erste Frage, also
the first question you're asking, well, to give you a precise time window is rather difficult. I'm going to stick with my guns. The results need to be analyzed first, but if you look at the time period it took us to analyze the results in summer, I don't think that any concrete proposals will be made this year. After all, the year is coming to an end. You need to change whatever you want to change. You need to do that with a certain degree of care and caution, but I don't think that we are going to see a lot of time expire early in 2017 for particular changes insofar as they are necessary. The second question as to the Federal Ministry of Interior Matters will be operational around Christmas and the New Year, yes.
All right, well, we'll leave that press conference there. That's with the government spokesman in Berlin, expressing really a lot of gratitude to the Italian authorities, who, of course, we heard a little earlier in the morning, saying that Anis Amri was shot and killed during a routine police patrol. He was stopped by police officers and in a shootout was killed in Milan sometime in the early hours of the morning. The Germans there also talking about how they've increased security checks at border points. And I'd like to bring in our correspondent Angus Crawford, who's been following events closely all morning. I thought that was very striking, Angus, the Germans speaking about more security checks at border points, exactly what you would expect. And yet we know now that Anis Amri took quite a circuitous route to get out of Germany and end up in Italy.
This is the fascinating thing we've learned this morning. We know from previous information that he was in Berlin at 4 a.m. on Tuesday morning. But what we've now been told is that he somehow travelled 1,200 kilometres across Germany into France, possibly crossing somewhere near Mulhouse, and ended up in Chambéry. From Chambéry, we're now told he probably took another train into Italy to Turin. From Turin, he took another train to Milan, and in Milan he walked out of the station there, the central station, at 1 a.m. in the morning. He walked across to a busy main square, the 1st of May square, Piazza Primo Maggio, and there he was challenged by chance by two police officers on routine patrol. They thought he looked suspicious. When they challenged him, we are told he pulled out a pistol, shot one of the officers while shouting, "God is great." It appears the other officer returned fire and killed him. So we know that he had this extraordinary journey across Europe that took something like 4 days, 3.5 days, which ended with the shooting in Milan this morning at 3 a.m. So clearly there is a very serious question to be asked now about how he managed to travel. We don't know exactly how he travelled all the way to Milan via France, a journey of something like 1,400, 1,500 kilometres across Europe. That's a really important issue. Something else that's come out this morning is that the Italian authorities say they are still investigating. There are other issues they need to investigate before they can talk fully about them. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that he had a support network in Germany? Does that mean he had a support network in Milan that they're still investigating? So two really significant issues which we need answers to. And one thing to leave you with, which I thought was fascinating towards the end of that press conference, was that the Ministry of Interior in Germany essentially told us about the scale of the problem that faces them. They talked about 330 relevant people, essentially people they are suspect of having either terrorist sympathies or being involved in terrorism, present in the country on their radar, needing surveillance. So there's a very significant number that they put in front of us today.